Formula One is back. After a short winter break, the 2015 cars have now been unveiled. From Mexico to Maranello, the teams have revealed the culmination of all their hard work, and most are ready to go after the first test in Jerez. Mercedes look to be the dominant force like in 2014, but Ferrari top the timesheets. Can they, or anyone else, close the gap on last year's world champions? Hello and welcome to our F1 Development Special. We're going to be dissecting everything from Jerez and looking ahead to the brand new season. And helping me to do this, I'm very pleased to say I'm joined in the studio by former Ferrari, Mercedes and McLaren engineer Steve Clark and technical analyst Craig Scarborough. Gents, a very warm welcome to the show. Now, although they didn't achieve the fastest times across the 4 days, Mercedes completed nearly 600 kilometres more than any other team. Is this the most dominant first test display, Craig, we've ever seen?
In the years I've followed testing, about 15 years, I've never seen a team go out on the first morning with a brand new car, brand new power unit and start to practice race distances. It's very impressive.
Certainly was. Well, Steve, Ferrari, they did top the timesheets. Did you impress you?
Yes, it did. It was nice to see, certainly a nice boost for the guys back in Maranello. Doesn't tell the whole story, but it's certainly better than being slowest every day.
It certainly is. OK, well, we'll be discussing all the teams, including Ferrari, in a little more detail later, but here's what's coming up on the show. Our very own Tate Kravitz caught up with McLaren's engineering director Matt Morris in Jerez as they look at this year's intriguing technical battleground. Craig will be on the Skypad with his own drawings, revealing his findings from Jerez. And with Ferrari topping the timing sheets in Spain, we look at whether anyone can rival a dominant Mercedes in 2015. Well, before we get to the technical differences and the impact on performance, let's just reflect on the aesthetics of the cars. Now, Craig, you were out in Jerez. What was your overall impressions of what you saw?
In terms of aesthetics, I think the cars are much better looking this year. Perhaps a little bit more samey this year than some of the very different interpretations we saw of the nose regulations last year. But all of the cars are that bit more refined in the second year of the regulations. So there's lots of interesting details starting to appear on the cars now. OK,
changes aside, which teams launched the best and the worst looking cars, do you think?
Probably the best looking, livery aside, probably the McLaren is the most interesting car for me to look at under the skin. And yeah, I hate to say it because I'm a big fan of the team, but probably Sauber with the quite bright livery and very much a carryover from last year's car. Probably, I don't want to call it the worst, but the least nice car.
Very diplomatic. Steve, what were your impressions of the Ferrari?
It's looking good. You know, it's looking a lot nicer on track, nicer to drive than the car they were struggling with last year. Modest changes. The nose regulation was the least change for Ferrari than anyone. Car's been tidied up around the back, and it appears to be working a lot better than last season, which is obviously good news.
Well, talking of a car that wasn't particularly bright, Red Bull's camouflage livery, difficult, I expect, to replicate in an illustration. But you did manage it, which we will see later.
Yes, yeah. It's interesting. You know, we don't really tend to see these dazzle camouflage schemes on test cars. They come out with their full livery. And as much as all of these white splashes and speckles all over the car were to hide the detail, for my eye, the satin finish on the car actually made it easier for me to understand some of the curves and shapes on there. So we'll see a bit more of that later.
Well, we asked you, the fans, to get in touch online via Facebook and Twitter with any questions you had for us, Steve and Craig. We were inundated with them, so we'll try and get through as many as we can during the course of the show. But to kick it off, first of all, from aesthetics to acoustics, Sarah Merritt by Twitter says there's been lots of talk about the sound of the 2015 cars. Are they really louder, or is it just the acoustics of Jerez? Well, this one first of all to you, Craig.
Well, first of all, I think I should say that I was a fan of the engine sound last year anyway. I wasn't a massive fan of being deafened by the old V8 engines. The new engines are much more interesting. But true enough, certainly at Jerez, the engine sounded much louder, a bit more raucous note to the engine. I don't know if that's... there's been no engine regulation changes. There's no reason they should sound any different. I think the teams probably are working the engines a bit harder this year after their redesign, and that has come out certainly in Jerez, which tends to be a bit of a bowl, and the echoes and the acoustics probably improved there. If we went to the much flatter Barcelona in a couple of weeks, then it would be interesting to see if that sound is still there.
Maybe it's just the fact that we've forgotten what it sounds like. We've all had a break, then they come back, and then it's like, oh, it might be louder.
I think there's probably a great deal of that. I think there are two things. The acoustics of Jerez, it's surrounded by little hills, so you get the reflections all the time. And I think last year the talk was how quiet they were. Yeah. Then we come back, they're actually quite noisy, and you know that's the difference. It's just our perception.
Can't win, can you? OK, well, outside of designing a great-looking and great-sounding car, what were the biggest challenges the teams face heading into 2015? Well, our very own Ted Kravitz went to see McLaren's engineering director, Matt Morris, to find out.
Well, 2015 is going to see an intriguing technical battleground with lots of areas of competition amongst the teams. I'm down at McLaren Honda with their engineering director, Matt Morris. Matt, what are we going to see this year in general? Should we start off with engines? Is that still going to be, or power units, sorry, is that still going to be the sort of main area of competition, do you think?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think people are gradually coming together a little bit more. Obviously, the start of last year, there was there's quite a big difference in people's performance, but I think as time goes on, you'll see people sort of coming close together in terms of performance. But yeah, for sure, it's a battleground. The engine manufacturers have been able to spend their tokens this year, so they've been able to upgrade their engines, and it'll be interesting to see whether some people have made bigger strides than others.
The rules have changed a little bit on engines in that we're allowed now variable inlet trumpets. Yep. Can you explain what benefit they give to the engine and therefore the driver?
So it's basically it's just a way of getting more performance out of the engine. I mean, variable trumpets are not a new thing. They've been around in F1 for quite a while, and they basically change their length with engine speed, and it just means that you get more performance out of the engine for a given engine speed. So it's not new technology, and like you say, everybody will finish up with it, so everybody will have the same benefit at the end of the day.
Okay. Does it make the engine more efficient though, fuel-wise? Or?
Yeah. I mean, if you get more, I mean, we're obviously fuel limited, so the more power you get out of the engine, then effectively you become more fuel efficient. Okay,
let's move on to aero if we can. Do you think the noses are going to be a sort of area of competitions? Obviously, it's a very visual thing. People notice the difference between yours and Ferraris. We've got a certain concept, and then Mercedes and Lotus have got quite a sort of stubby nose.
Yeah, I don't think it's a battleground really. I mean, we've looked at short and long noses. There's not a lot of performance in it really. I think once you've chosen where you're going to be, you then design the rest of the car around it. Same as last year, we didn't see people jumping around between different nose designs just because there's not performance in it, and it's more work changing the nose to then design the rest of the car around the nose. So I think probably what we see here will be what we see all season. Don't see it being a battleground really.
Okay, well, talking about concepts, what are the concepts on the front axle? Quite a few people have gone with a hollow front axle, which channels air out of it and round to the back. Again, not a new concept. We've seen it in Formula One quite a lot. But for example, McLaren have changed concept. I don't think last year you had that idea, and now you've gone with it this year. Is that right?
Yeah. We've changed our concept. So we're testing various things in winter testing. We'll decide on what we race based on the results that we get here. So yeah, it seems to be people are gravitating towards that. So
yeah, you're running it. Ferrari are running it. Other people, but not Mercedes, interestingly. So they clearly think that their concept isn't right for that.
Yeah, I mean it does affect quite a lot of parts on the car. So it's not something that you can sort of jump to and from. If you're sort of going to go down that route, then like I say, it has a lot of knock-on effects on the rest of the car. So you sort of choose your bed and then you lay in it, sort of thing. So that could be something that a lot of people work on throughout the year, and there definitely is performance there.
Okay, what about rear aero? Is sculpted as tight as possible a big gain for the teams?
Well, it looks good, doesn't it? So F1 cars that look good tend to be fast in my experience. But no, of course it is. I mean, it's aerodynamics is all about sort of more downforce for less drag, and obviously the cleaner you can make the car around all the packaging constraints, then the better it'll be. And you know, we've clearly done what I think is a great job this year, you know, in partnership with Honda. It's not just been us; it's been a joint mission to get all that packaging done and create the tight coat that we've got. So.
Okay, and finally, Matt, tyres. We all talk about aero and we talk about engines, don't we? And then inevitably at the end of races, people only talk about the tyres, don't they? Is that going to be the same as usual? How different are the 2015 tyres?
Not massively different, to be honest with you. We've had a few changes from Pirelli, but I think we just face all the same problems. You know, I say problems. You know, it's just all about getting them in the right window. That's the challenge. You know, different circuits, different ambient conditions. You know, they have quite a narrow operating band, and it's just making sure that we get them in the sweet spot. So again, you know, it's a massive part of the race weekend actually. You know, the tyres, and when you get it right, it does pay dividends.
Yeah, Pirelli say it's going to be quite racy this year, don't they? With the change in the which will be good fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the more fun, the better.
Okay, Matt, thank you so much. So there we go. I think we've quite a comprehensive outline of all the technical battlegrounds for 2015.
Thank you, Ted. So tyres could be a key factor this year, but a couple of things of note there from Matt are that McLaren look to be going with the front-blown axle and have a size 0 rear of the car, something which Craig will talk us through at the Skypad right now.
So let's then have a look at the cars. And we'll start with the McLaren MP430 in its new livery. We're expecting that to change. Obviously, when we've got the livery, the good thing now with these drawings is that we can take the colour away and actually see the detail of the car underneath. First things we notice with the McLaren, they've gone for a very long nose at the front, and then towards the back, pretty much everything behind the driver has been shrunk right back down to create this size 0 rear end that the team were talking about. So if we have a look at some of this in detail now. First of all, look at this size 0 rear end. McLaren, with their new Honda engine, have had to package all of the coolers, the turbo intercoolers and energy recovery system coolers all into the tightest possible space. Now, with side pods, you want them to be as small as possible in order to get more airflow to the rear of the car here. The problem you have with large intercoolers is it creates very large side pods and creates drag, which slows the car on the straight line. So what McLaren have done is they have put some of the coolers in the side pods, brought everything as far forwards as they can, and then there's a large cooler mounted directly above the engine, which is quite unique on the McLaren, a very large, long cooler, I believe, for the energy recovery system. And this is why you have such a large roll hoop at the front here, and that will vents out through the back of the car. And then from there, there's not much mechanical parts aft of the intercoolers, so the side pods are able to come right in, and McLaren have repackaged as much as they can inside the gearbox, much like Ferrari have done last year, in order to get the maximum airflow to the back of the car. If we now look at the front of the car, what McLaren have done is follow this blown front axle concept. So what you have is large brake ducts on the inside of the wheel picking up air and then forcing it through the hollow axle. Now, this air doesn't do anything to cool the brakes, it doesn't go anywhere near the brakes, it's purely an aerodynamic function. And what then happens is the airflow comes out of this hollow exit at the end of the axle and pushes the airflow that's coming around the car out as far as possible so that it doesn't get sucked back in between the rear wheels and the side pods, which would wreck the diffuser performance. And this all works as a big aero scheme with the front wing end plate in order to push the airflow around the back of the car. Moving on to the Mercedes. The W06 2015 car looks very much like the W05 from last year that won the World Championships. As much as it looks like an evolution, under the skin there's lots of changes to the car, particularly in the packaging of the power unit and the suspension. Things that we can see that have changed are the nose. If you remember last year, Mercedes had this U-shaped nose to get around the regulations. With the change in nose regulations this year, this initial nose is very short but also very wedge-shaped, and we can expect this to change before Melbourne for a much more arched shape once they're past the crash tests. Further back down the car, the main other area that's changed is in the packaging of the cooling and the roll hoop. Last year, the car had extra inlets around the roll hoop to feed coolers at the back of the car. This year, much like McLaren, they have a split roll hoop inlet, which feeds ducts which go down to the back of the engine area and cools the energy recovery system. In changing some of the packaging, you can see that the side pods have tucked in much tighter around the back of the car. The things that haven't changed so far, which is why the car looks so similar, are things like the front wing, some elements around the front of the side pods, and also the rear wing. These parts will change before Melbourne, and this will be what gives the car its boost in performance after testing.
OK, thanks for now, Craig. Steve, a pertinent question from Stephen McCulloch via Facebook. This is what he has to say. He says, have Mercedes made a mistake not going for a front-blown axle like McLaren?
I think it's not a case of a mistake or the right decision. All of these technical details on the car are in fact a compromise, and the compromise is, you know, what the technical directors have to juggle. So the front blown axle, as Craig pointed out, is a way of blowing the front wing wake outboard, or sucking it outboard probably, to stop it going underneath the car and losing downforce that way. So it's an aerodynamic benefit. The compromises are that you're taking away potential brake cooling, which is sometimes at a premium. There's also a practical problem with it, in that you require quite a large wheel nut or hole in the axle to get the airflow out, because you've not got any pressure driving it out, only the forward movement of the car. So, for example, Williams were the first people to have it, and I think, if you remember, they had quite a few problems in pit stops, which, well, not knowing the details, but my guess is that was from the practicality of that. It wasn't, you know, it's not the guys are less practiced than others. Ferrari, we saw it on the Williams, copied it, saw an aerodynamic benefit, and didn't race it all last year because of that potential sort of race reliability problem.
Well, Steve, as you just said there, Ferrari, like McLaren, clearly think there is a benefit in it. Just how much quicker, though, on track does this actually make the car?
I think that's always a very difficult question. I think in the wind tunnel, initially, we saw quite a big benefit, like a couple of tenths even, which doesn't sound much, but it's, you know, that's quite significant in development terms. However, when you factor in the compromises, that gets diminished. So the initial question was, have Mercedes made a mistake? Well, I guess Mercedes have looked at it, done their calculations, and decided that, given the gain and then taking away all the penalties, it's not worth it. You know, it remains to be seen in Melbourne who's actually made the right decision or not.
OK, Craig, well, the first test didn't quite go to plan for McLaren, did it? Is this the right time to be trying something new like this when you're also introducing a new power unit to the car?
It's probably the best time, with the way the engine freeze regulations are, is to build the engine that you want now, the power unit you want now, with all of the detailed packaging, and suffer because you won't be able to make big changes to the layout and the structure of the engine as the years go by with the current formula. So, yeah, they had to bite the bullet. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the problems that McLaren and Honda had this week weren't big fundamental problems with the engine. I mean, the oil wasn't pouring out, it wasn't setting on fire. It was just detailed electronic issues. And when you first package this all into the car and get all the systems talking together, it's not unusual to have these sort of problems. So I think they'll very soon overcome these kind of start-up issues and then start to get mileage.
I think also, to be fair to Honda and McLaren, you need to go back, rewind 12 months to Jerez last year, when everyone had a new engine, a new package.
Yeah.
People barely ran for the first week, so they're clearly ahead of where we were 12 months ago, from the same starting point. So I don't think it's a sign of a disaster. We fix problems very quickly in this industry.
OK, time now for another question from Facebook, this one from Odin Schooley. He says, this is regarding McLaren's size 0 rear end. Is it likely McLaren could run into overheating problems because of their design? This one to you, Craig.
Well, it's hard to say so far, because they've not had that much mileage at what was quite a cold Jerez. I think the key thing that we saw was that the car wasn't coming back into the pits with burning bodywork and with smoke coming out from the carbon fibre placed in the wrong place inside. Don't forget, McLaren have also had a year to run these new generation engines, albeit the Mercedes engine last year, so they've already got lots of data and know-how in exactly how much cooling the car needs. And then again, with that top radiator that we were speaking about on the Skypad earlier, as much as the side pods are much smaller, there is cooling area elsewhere and all these body panels can be switched at particularly hot races. I think probably Bahrain and Malaysia being the first two on the calendar that would require extra cooling. So I don't think they've taken any big risks. They know what they're doing, and I don't expect that will be a topic for later in the year to worry about.
OK, Owen, I hope that answers your question there. Right. All eyes and ears were on Mercedes to see just how dominant they'd be ahead of the new season, and they didn't disappoint. But Lewis Hamilton says he's struggling to tell the difference between the new W06 and the all-conquering W05. So, Steve, could Mercedes, have they played it too safe?
I don't know. I mean, we don't know what they're running. What we've seen is they've gone out the box, and as Craig says, they've gone straight into race distances, straight into long-running mileage on the car, which is a job that you absolutely have to do. You have to assure yourself of reliability, and it was, if anything, it was their one Achilles heel last year. So that's something they want to concentrate on. I think it's also significant that it probably says that they haven't got the car aerodynamic package that they expect to race. So they're getting all their groundwork done, they're getting all their mileage done, ahead of having the parts on the car that they really need to work on the performance on. So but it looks like they're setting their stall out pretty well so far. You know, they look pretty confident.
So perhaps a car of evolution as opposed to revolution. And then, OK, do you see them vulnerable to the sort of performance surge they themselves enjoyed a year ago, Craig?
I don't think so. I mean, if we remember to the back end of last year, Mercedes had a clear performance advantage over everybody, both from the power and the chassis side of things. So I don't see anyone else is able to close that gap over the winter. I think what we may find is as the season progresses, teams like Ferrari and Red Bull and potentially McLaren and Williams will build up their development and actually then start to catch Mercedes. So I think the second half of this year, certainly as we come into those last flyaways, I think who's going to get the podium will be a much tighter battle than it had been throughout most of 2014.
It'll be exciting to watch. OK, thank you very much for now, guys. Join us after the break, when we'll be looking at whether any of the other teams have narrowed the gap on Mercedes over the winter. See you in a few minutes. Hi there, welcome back to this F1 Development Special. We're going to continue our look at this year's cars following their launches and first outings in Jerez. And joining us is Steve Clark, and back at the Sky Pad is Craig Scarborough, who's been looking at Red Bull and Ferrari. But Craig, you're going to start with Williams.
So, if we have a look at the front end of the Williams, we talk about one of the key technical regulation changes this year, which is the nose. So, if we take away all of this livery, we can see that Williams have gone for a very short nose, about as short as the regulations will allow. And what the regulations have done this year is, whereas last year they demanded a cross-section at the tip of the nose here to be quite low to improve crash protection, the second area here, which is new for this year, which is mandatory, wasn't there. So teams used to have this very finger-shaped nose or an anteater-shaped nose. Obviously, that had some issues with crash testing and aesthetics, whether the FIA will ever actually admit to that. So what you now have is you have to have a mandatory cross-section here. It can be any shape, and then a second one 10 centimetres behind that. And this makes the whole of the nose much bigger and creates a much bigger obstruction to the airflow that's trying to go back around the car. Obviously, it's going to make the car much better for crash testing. So, key change for all of the teams. Everyone's doing everything slightly differently. Williams, with this little thumb tip sticking out the end, have just shrunk back all of the bodywork to the bare minimum. And I'll expect a few other teams will probably follow this direction during the year. If we now go on to the Red Bull. Red Bull had this dazzle camouflage on the car for testing, and the aim was to make it more difficult to understand the shapes of the curves of the car. However, with drawings, we can turn that livery off and actually see the Red Bull underneath. What's interesting with the Red Bull, the last Adrian Newey design, is that it wasn't hiding any detail. What was actually hiding is lots of very simple and clean lines, particularly around the side pods, which for the Red Bull this year, if you remember last year, had very large, very long and bulky side pods in order to cool the Renault engine. They've actually been able to shrink these, move all of the mass of the side pods forward to create lots of clear air through to the back of the car. And this is all done with aerodynamics through the side pods. the radiators and the Renault power unit itself are both having to manage the same amount of heat. So it's incredible that Red Bull have been able to do that with their car this year. Again, Red Bull have gone for a very short nose with the thumb sticking out of the end, very similar to Williams, a little bit more curvy and shapely, particularly around the the front wing mounting pylons. If we have a look at some of the other technical secrets of the Red Bull, for quite a few years Red Bull have had what we call an S-duct, a ducted nose system, which was actually copied from Sauber initially. And what this does, there's a little U-shaped inlet under the nose which gathers up the airflow passing under the car and then ducts it through an S-shape and back over the top of the chassis. And what this does is just cleans up the airflow over and under the car and also allows the team to narrow the cross-section of the nose, which itself is an aerodynamic advantage. And then lastly, Ferrari. Again, Ferrari have made quite a step with their car this year. Aerodynamically, it's much more detailed, much more subtle in some of the things that they've been doing. The most obvious change is they've gone for the very long nose, very similar to McLaren. In concept, the Ferrari is very similar to the McLaren in lots of ways. Tuck down the side pods and the rear bodywork, all shrunken down there. Ferrari have repackaged some elements of their power unit as well in order to move things into the right place. Probably the biggest area of discussion on the Ferrari is its front suspension. Ferrari for a few years now have run a pull rod suspension system, and what this means is you have an upper wishbone and a lower wishbone that hold the wheel on, but then to transfer the wheel's motion into the springs and dampers inside the car there is a rod, and you can choose whether this rod pushes upwards, like most teams use, to reach the top of the car and then via a rocker operate the suspension, or as Ferrari do, have a pull rod where it goes downwards from the wheel to the bottom of the chassis, then operates the rockers and the suspension internally. Now, in terms of geometry and kinematics and compliance, both systems are exactly the same. There's no performance benefit in that respect from one or the other. However, the pull rod system is a little bit heavier. Some of the loads are being passed in the different directions to push rod, which means particularly the top wishbone has to be a bit heavier, but all of the internal suspension could be lower, which is a centre of gravity benefit. But the key reason the team have gone this direction and have steadfastly stuck this direction is that this very flat pull rod here is in a very good orientation with the front wing to actually use as an aerodynamic surface to turn the airflow from the wing back around the car. So it's much more about aerodynamics and a lot less about suspension geometry.
Absolutely fascinating stuff there from Craig. Thank you very much. Well, you mentioned there that it didn't give much of an advantage having a pull rod front suspension. But Steve, will it make any difference to the drivers? Will they notice it?
No, in principle, as Craig pointed out, as a mechanical system, the two are equivalent. Sometimes, given the height of the noses on the cars, the choice between a push rod and pull rod isn't actually mechanically all that obvious. I was, let's say, surprised when we introduced it on the Ferrari, but when you look at the details, the loads are the same. So I don't think there's a big weight penalty even, and the difference is purely aerodynamic. You know, and again, that's a choice and a philosophy. Ferrari have put the pull rod so up the top and out of the way of the front wing and the brake duct. So for the driver, no, it's invisible. If there is an aerodynamic advantage, he'll feel that. But again, it's like all of these things. It's a compromise and a choice that teams make early on and design the rest of the cars around it.
Okay. Well, in terms of topping the timesheets in the first test, Ferrari certainly enjoyed a good run. 3 of the 4 days they topped the timesheets. The other day, the Ferrari-powered Sauber, they topped the timesheets as well. But just how much can we read into the progress of these Ferrari-powered motor units, power units already?
Well, it could also be the contrary. It could also be that they're running last year's power units and therefore running them at full speed and, you know, without the caution and introduction of careful introduction of the new parts that that a newer power unit would have. So, for example, Ferrari rather cleverly interpreted the upgrade for 2015 that all the teams are allowed to not have a time limit. So rather than be forced to introduce their new, 35-point improved engine for the first race, they can do it when they like. So perhaps they're taking time with their with the introduction of the new parts? I honestly don't know the answer, but you know, maybe Ferrari haven't got their whole new engine package in the car yet.
Okay, that's the engines. From a personnel perspective, though, there's been a lot of changes. Will the arrival of Maurizio Arrivabene, will that have a positive impact on the team, do you think, Craig?
I hope so. I mean, I think the one thing that Ferrari really need is a very strong leader with some strong direction for the team, because Ferrari can often slip back to the ways we've seen with the team in the past, and I think management, certainly during the Ross Brawn era, obviously stabilised that, and I think the team have drifted during that time. As long as this guy comes in, bangs his fist on the desk and gets things sorted, I think that's good. What we don't want is him to be around for a short period and then succeeded by someone else, because the team will start to fall into turmoil.
OK, and also, how much will Ferrari benefit having Sebastian Vettel's knowledge of Red Bull? Will that benefit them?
It's an interesting one, because when drivers come from other teams, we usually debrief them quite heavily, quite detailedly about, you know, how was there, especially if they've come from a competitor with advantage over us.
Extract the information.
You really want to extract the information. Unfortunately, the reality is often they're not aware. You know, they're not aware of the technical detail. They get in and drive the car, and probably the biggest feedback is, I can't make the car do this, or the engine is much more difficult to use, or something. It's very unusual that they'll be able to tell us. You know, they're not going to be able to give us a front wing profile or a list of suspension settings, even though they'd like to. You know, but for sure, having a quick driver from a competitive team in the car is always going to be a help.
Well, the team he left behind, Red Bull, produced a car-donning camouflage livery. As Craig explained, it's noticeably different from last year, with a new Williams-style nose and Titan side pods. But surely the most important thing is that the Renault engine becomes reliable and competitive.
That's the biggest question. Red Bull have put a lot of work back into the Renault power unit program through last year and through the winter, and they also have the engine guru Mario Ilian working on the combustion side of the engine as well, which for Renault, being, you know, a complete power unit manufacturer, is quite an admittance that they have a third party coming in consulting them on a core part of the engine's function. They had some teething problems during the test around water pumps and batteries and bits and pieces. That can all be resolved, but probably Renault, arguably more so than Ferrari, have got a bigger step in order to regain the lost power they have against the benchmark, which is the Mercedes engine. So they're going to have a very long season ahead of them.
Right. Red Bull's Adrian Newey has always been synonymous with innovative chassis design and pushing regulations to the limit, but there seems to be a sense of frustration creeping in him that the chassis regulations are now too restrictive under the current regulations and rules. So are we at a saturation point now for new designs and interpretations? Steve?
Clearly not. There are differences between the cars. If we reach a saturation point, then all the cars are the same and all the performances are the same. We're nowhere near that. You know, the gap from the front to the back is as big as it's ever been. So, for that reason, you would probably say there's good cause to leave the regulations relatively stable for a few years for the cars to become more equal.
OK, with teams only given 4 penalty-free engines this season, could chassis design, could that be the key to success, Craig?
I think this year will still be very much a power unit defined year. I think it's very much how your power unit is performing at different types of circuits is going to be the key thing. The differences will be between the teams with the same power unit. Unfortunately, we'll have slightly less variety because we have slightly less teams this year. But I think, you know, the battle will be between can Ferrari, can Renault and Honda bring their power unit up to the performance of the Mercedes, so that their chassis can then fight on more equal terms with the Mercedes.
And I think with the one less engine, the difficulty is reliability, which
yes.
it won't be a question of performance unless teams feel they need to turn the engines down in order to guarantee that reliability. And if you like, reliability is crucial in this sport. If you're fighting for the championships, you know, so the top teams are the ones that...
We saw it last year.
Exactly. They cannot afford to have a failure and lose a race, or, you know. Whereas in the middle and the back of the grid, surprisingly, it's much less important. They're looking for the sort of one-off, point scoring opportunity. So I don't know whether the teams will choose to turn the engines down or the manufacturers will be forced to do that. Remains to be seen. I think not, though. I think they'll get on top of it.
Right, on to Williams. They pretty much flew under the radar in Jerez, based on their performance across the 4 days. How much ground have they made up?
It's very hard to say because they haven't, as you say, they've had a very workmanlike test. They were just doing all of their aero tests and all their other sensors and bits and pieces. And they weren't going out there trying to set fast times. Both the drivers were very complimentary about the car. You can see that the car is a step forwards in performance. And when you went out on track and saw it around some of the particularly damp and trickier corners at Jerez, you see the car was much better balanced and much less of a handful than it was last year. So if Williams have resolved some of this kind of rear-end stability issues that they did have in 2014 with this year, knowing how fast they were by the back end of last year, then they should really be a big threat for the top teams.
Can you see them, Steve, winning a race this year?
I'd like to reserve judgment until we actually
Not allowed.
see the cars a bit closer to their race trim, in the next couple of tests. But the interesting thing with Williams was they were setting about their testing in a very disciplined, business-like manner, the same as Mercedes. That shows quite a confidence that they've got something useful. They don't feel the need for showboating at this stage.
What do you reckon, Craig? Are they in a stronger position than Ferrari and Red Bull at this stage?
I think theoretically, yes, they should start where they finished off from last year, and I think they arguably deserved a victory last year. And I thought for a while Abu Dhabi, with the Mercedes hybrid problems they were having, was going to give them that opportunity. Sadly, it wasn't to be. So yeah, they should be out there chasing Mercedes from day one, while Ferrari and Renault develop their package through those kind of early teething problems.
OK, on to Lotus now, looking elsewhere. They've switched to a Mercedes engine. Are the automatic, though, going to jump up the grid? Is that?
I think that they're certainly hoping that that's going to be the case. Nothing's guaranteed. You need it's not just engine. You need a decent aerodynamic package around that.
Are they?
Let's wait and see. I would think so. I think there's a lot of good people there. They know how to make a good car. So I think they'll see an improvement with that switch.
OK, Force India, they didn't test in Jerez. Are they now at a major disadvantage, Craig?
It is a big problem. The more testing you miss, the more opportunity you get for getting the basics right. Yeah. Once we start the season at Melbourne, you have Friday running, which is 2.5 hours, virtually no time at all, no testing. So these 12 days at the beginning of the year are critical in getting everything sorted out. Yep. And they really need to get that car onto the track and getting mileage underneath it, even though they'll have the Mercedes complete rear-end package with the power unit and the gearbox. But they have to get their chassis sorted and all the integration issues. So it's a big hit.
The danger for them, if you like, perhaps losing 4 days, if they go to the next test and everything's fine, it won't be that costly. They'll claw that. The real danger for them is if they go to the next test and have some fundamental reliability problem, they've then got very little time to fix it in order to prove it and get to the first race.
There'll be a lot of fingers crossed in Force India.
Yes, exactly. If they've taken big technical risks, it could be very difficult for them.
OK, moving on to Toro Rosso. How much of a disadvantage are they at not having experienced any driver feedback? They're both very young.
Well, yes, it'd be nice to be very young. They're very young, but they're very quick guys. They've proven themselves. And in reality, it's Toro Rosso's mission statement is to take people from the Red Bull driver program and put them in the cars. So they're doing exactly what they're there to be doing. So I don't think they can either complain or be upset. And generally, actually, when young guys get to Formula One, they're in pretty good shape in terms of their preparation and training to help the teams out with the cars.
Gents, we could talk all day. I could go on forever, but I'm afraid our time has beaten us. So thank you very much for joining us this week. But of course, you can keep up to date with any further developments and updates ahead of the new season on Sky Sports News HQ's Sky Sports F1 and online. So thank you very much for joining me today. Don't forget also that the F1 Midweek Report is back after Melbourne just 5 weeks to go until the new season kicks off. And I, for one, cannot wait.
Enjoy Sky Sports F1 Live on all screens, on the go, and the best bits on demand.